Now, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel later on. For today's meeting, we're very pleased to welcome Kaylen James and Samantha Majhor, who will be presenting their work titled Remembering from the Heart and Mind, Oceti Sakowin Approaches to Digital Archiving and Website Design. Samantha Majhor is an assistant professor of English and Race, Ethnicity, and Indigeneity Studies at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, along with co-project investigator Chris Pexa, Spirit Lake, Dakota. Her current project develops a digital map connecting story to place in Oceti Sakowin homelands through grant funding from the Mellon Foundation. She co-directs Marquette's Indigeneity Lab, which supports undergraduate research in Native studies topics, including wild rice restoration along the Menominee River Valley, archival research and outreach from the Bureau of Catholic Indian Mission Records, and Indigenous Milwaukee digital map via the Joris Family Fund. Also see her most recent publication, The Blue Beaded Dress at the Field Museum in the Works of Susan Power, in Sale, Fall-Winter 2023. Dr. Majhor is a descendant of the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux. Kaylen James is a doctoral candidate in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and a Charles Eastman Fellow in Native American and Indigenous Studies at Dartmouth College. Broadly, her research utilizes Lakota and Dakota ways of knowing and not knowing to critically interrogate the way in which digital technologies, new media, status, and fame work together to reproduce subtler capitalist structures of affect and thought, particularly through social networking algorithms and user interface designs. Drawing upon this research, Kaylen assists Drs. Chris Pexa, Spirit Lake, Dakota, and Samantha Majhor with implementing and designing their digital story mapping project, Remapping the Oceti Sakowin Oyate. Kaylen is Itazipco Lakota and Mdewakantunwan Dakota. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Kaylen and Samantha. Welcome.
Thank you. I think we'll go ahead and get started with Sam, actually, with her own introduction.
Okay. Well, and I think I'm not sure if it's the same on everyone's screen, but on my screen, to see our PowerPoint, I have to go up to the top and click on Kaylen James' screen. Is that right for everybody?
We see it.
Okay. So just a little bit of a further introduction here. Just wanted to say hello, all my relatives. It's great to be here in this digital space with you. I'm coming to you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so the homelands of the Potawatomi, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk nations. And as you can see on the screen, the background is Ihanktuan and Assiniboine. And I'm a direct descendant, as it says, from Fort Peck, Assiniboine and Sioux tribes. You see some of my family names written there. And I included on this slide a photograph. The small boy in the photograph is my grandfather, Walter Majhor, when he was a young boy at Fort Peck. And I included this one because it speaks to our project in the way that memory is connected to place. And one of my relatives somewhere along the line wrote on the picture with a little arrow pointing down Poplar Creek, looking west. And so this little bit of archival notation of where this photo is taken and, you know, what orienting us to the direction and place that captures this moment. These are the kinds of things and stories that we hope to tell with the map we're going about. I'll turn it over to Kaylen to do further introduction as well.
Yeah, so we listed that as Itazipco and Mdewakantunwan, but I'm actually also Oglala and Sinjangu. My my dad is Dakota and Sinjangu, and my mom's Itazipco and Oglala. So that means I have relatives pretty much all over Oceti Sakowin homelands. And so I list who some of my Tioshbae are across these homelands. These are a lot of my grandparents' relatives. So if you notice, it covers basically Minnesota, all the way down to like Pine Ridge, all the way up even to Standing Rock. So my communities, I grew up in Rapid City, South Dakota. When I was a teenager, we moved to Flandreau. But my first memories growing up, there's this saying I heard a long time ago, as they say in their oral stories, they say that when the first place where we have our memories, that's kind of where our consciousness comes into being. And that's where you're rooted to that place. My earliest memories are on the tree with my grandparents, Tim Red Dog and Annie Good Bear. So I write with this place, with these relatives in my mind and heart. And the reason we introduce ourselves as, the reason we introduce ourselves as your relatives is this is a part of our work. We situate our work as, strengthening the collective spirit. And we first do that by introducing ourselves as your relatives. So I'm going to go ahead and send it back to Sam so she can actually introduce our project.
So these are just some guiding questions. Also that maybe will sort of set the table.
Actually, I think this is I'll
you
go ahead and
set the table.
Oh, so this is kind of what the project, very broadly is about, but there's actually, so a lot of this presentation is kind of coming a little bit from the work I do from critiquing technology and new media. And I draw a lot from these oral stories, from language, from ceremonies, from dances, and a lot from my own memories of community. And so a lot of these, so there's this provocation this is Sievert Youngbear. He was a Lakota, and he wrote this book back in 1994, and I can't remember the R.D. Thies. I don't know how to say that name, but there's a provocation in this book that sat with me for a long time. I still don't know how to work with it, how to think about it, but we live in an age right now where, with settler colonialism, there was a lot of forced erasure, a lot of, misremembering of our histories, this attempt to basically erase our stories, our way of understanding the world. And so there's this idea that, we're using a lot of digital technology now to kind of, we digitize the language, we put them into indexes, we put them into the archives. And as we kind of do that, to me, there hasn't always been a real critical interrogation into what are those technologies? Why are we relying on these technologies now? And I'm somebody, just to kind of convey a little bit of neuroticism about my own upbringing. As a child, I was somebody, like, as soon as I was able to write, I wrote everything down. If you know me, when I was a teenager, I would have handwriting all over my arms. I have notebooks filled with notes and stuff from like years back. And as I got my first computer, it became, oh, well, now I have thousands of bookmarks and thousands of notes saved. And and it's always been a kind of a joke. But as I started doing this work, I started wondering, well, why do I hold on to these memories? Why do I hold on to all this knowledge? And when you think about Lakota, the way we remember, the way we kind of told, the way we taught, it was through oral stories. We don't have a long written record. And so I was trying to kind of reconcile these two things. And in his book, in his, I think it's his fourth chapter, Sievert Youngbear is talking about this interaction he had with his dad. And he says, when I was younger, I once asked my dad to tape record something for me because I wanted to be able to remember it. He refused and said, son, I will tell you all about it, but I don't want you to record it. If it's important enough for you, If it's important enough to you, you will and must remember it in your mind. If you record it on a machine, you'll lose it. We live, this era where there's this both real precarity of losing our fluent speakers. We live in an era that's also where social media really manufactures also precarity. And so trying to understand how we balance this remembering through like oral stories in place with also trying to create this archive, that's kind of some of the genesis of some of the questions that guide this project. So now I'll send it to Sam.
So just to talk a little bit about the project and the seeds of this project, we call it Remapping the Oceti Sakowin Oyate. I think in the end, the website with the map will have a bit of a different name. But we chose the idea of remapping because when thinking about stories connected to place, we want to do a sort of mapping, but we want to do mapping in a way that is true to Oceti Sakowin views of the land, right? And an Oceti Sakowin ethic, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go along today. But the idea was, and to some extent still is, that there are lots of sort of wonderful digital mapping projects coming out of from different Native nations, different Native scholars working on these kinds of remappings that are speaking back to the discipline of cartography, of mapping, of how we understand place. For us, we were really inspired by a couple, of our predecessors who in the digital mapping space, including in particular the Bedote memory map, which is, kind of a great grassroots small website that really focuses on a particular place in Minnesota, Makoche, in Minnesota, that we call, the Dakota call Bedote. And it's the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers. And this site really, then has videotaped interviews from speakers, from other community members that elaborate on the history of this particular sacred place in Minnesota. And some of it is done in the language, so it becomes a tool for language learners, which is how I first encountered it, the site. But then we were, thinking, how could we create a story map that is much more expansive across Oceti Sakowin homelands and communities. So kind of a much bigger plan and undertaking, just, land space wise, but also in engaging, how to engage all of our Oceti Sakowin communities. And our plan is to engage the 16 Oceti Sakowin Dakota Lakota communities within the US, and maybe at a future time also expand to our relatives in Canada as well. But another thing that, we thought was important was that this would be an expansive, inclusive map, but one that concentrated on connecting story to place. And early visions of this included things like perhaps capturing video of going down a particular stretch of the river, along with story. So how can we make this mixed media? How can we, for Dakota people who in large part remain in exile from Minnesota, for instance, just for example, if you were to want to remember the stories connected to Minnesota, but you're outside of it, how would you kind of be able to experience that space through these digital technologies? And again, connect story back to place. So those were our sort of generating questions. Soon enough, I will say that as we got into the project, after being awarded funding from Mellon, much of our concentration in these the first year and a half has been really on answering questions of digital sovereignty. Because we knew if we were to go to our communities and ask for stories, ask for us, to create this archive of recorded stories, whether in Dakota, Lakota language or in English, stories connected to place, that we would need to have an answer for how we were caring for these stories. And how these stories would, in the end, how the digital map in the end would be accessible to Oceti Sakowin people and communities, how it would care for stories that sometimes aren't appropriate to share across the World Wide Web. How would we ensure that we aren't creating an archive that can be data mined if we put information into the cloud? And of course, even more questions have arisen with the development of AI. And so very quickly, we've run into a lot of important questions surrounding the digital sovereignty issues with creating a website, with even just starting, and being able to answer how we're going to caretake these stories throughout their lifespan. And from the beginning, we've understood that in creating a website, and technology moves and shifts so quickly, that this archive will have a lifespan. So what does that mean as well? And I will say that you start out to create something that seems on the face of it quite simple, a repository of stories connected to place on a digital map. And very quickly, you find yourself embroiled in these kinds of really philosophical questions that have material impacts for our communities. And I have to say, it's been incredibly rewarding to work with our team and really delve into some of these serious questions that, according to many of our partners in the tech world, have never been asked before. How can we do this? Or are maybe being asked in other quarters, and we need to all talk to each other. So just to say, our team here, of course, want to highlight my co-PI, Chris Pexa, Kaylen, who we've introduced, and then Deacon DeBoer, who just graduated from the University of Minnesota with his master's, has been an essential player in the mix in our partnerships in developing this, and in developing the seed idea for this project as well. We must credit Deacon with that. And then more recently, and significantly, Sean Dorr, who is Anishinaabe and is a PhD student in computer sciences at the University of Minnesota, and helping us really envision a lot of the technical aspects of these data sovereignty issues. I will also say part of our original vision for the grant was to reach out in various ways to community and ensure that this is a community-led project. And one of those things is developing an advisory council. And so we've begun. We're still adding folks and names to the advisory council, but seeking out representation from across Oceti Sakowin communities. So we have a representative span of advisors. And these are folks who are held in high regard throughout our communities and can really guide us on some of the more precarious questions about developing an archive and a map. I think that hopefully orients people within the project we're working on, And now we want to delve a little bit more into some of the really fascinating questions that have come up. This visual, briefly, just gives you an idea of, again, the sort of on the face of it, that front end in a digital space that you get in the end when you have can go to a website and pull up a map and play around with it. A lot of the stuff we're thinking about is the behind the scenes, and this sort of house representation gives you a visual of all the building blocks that you put into place and where the material, we're kind of uncomfortable calling our stories data. So we need a better term for that, I think. But where the building blocks and the data live, and how those things are protected are just as important as what you're going to see, if not more. That's the work of it, than what you're going to see when you finally go to the site and perhaps be able to click on a place and hear a story. Kaylen, do you want to add anything to this slide? Otherwise, I'm gonna sign over to you for a bit.
Yeah, so this visual, Sam, Chris, Deacon, and I are not computer scientists. We are constantly wrestling with trying to understand all these different aspects of what it takes to create a website. And as we engage with Indigenous data sovereignty, we find like, oh, well, where's the logical end? The idea, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a bit, but this is kind of, we started talking about like, well, we want to create a website where we have our own archive. And what we found was like, well, if we wanted real control, we would need to have our own servers and mainframes. We don't have that capacity building in Lakota country. We don't have a rich resource of computer scientists, especially people who are trained to think more from this Lakota lens. And there are folks out there, but it just shows that, to use a cloud server, you're either going to be using Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. And then that creates a whole other host of issues around, data sovereignty. And so there is this aspect of like, we do need a community of people to help us kind of create this website, and this website will belong to the community. I just want to say the initial ideas going into this project might be coming from a few individuals, but what it looks like in 15 years might be something really different once the community decides this is what we want to do with this. So this is kind of, though, my jumping point into saying, though, that what we're dealing with is a lot of logics and a lot of, ideas around technology, computing that aren't necessarily always, that don't always align with what we might consider as Lakota logics or Oceti Sakowin logics. So part of my research then is to kind of start thinking about, well, how do we think about technology? But really, how do we think about like epistemology, Lakota knowledge creation? And there's these 3 quotes here that have kind of been guiding me in how I critique technology, how I critique new media. And in each of these quotes, there's this idea that there was a quote from my grandpa, and he has this journal that he kept, and he says something along the lines of how, when this person talks, the knowledge is just stuck in their head. It doesn't reach their heart. And I was kind of like, it was kind of coinciding with things I was reading through Ella Deloria at American Philosophical Society last summer. I got to look at the archives through there. But these quotes basically get at this idea that, knowledge for Lakota isn't supposed to stay in the head. It has to come through the spirit, through the heart, through the body. And so there was this beautiful story I had a chance to read called The Prairie Dogs, and Ella Deloria translates this story. And it says that basically there was this idea that all these animals were coming. It was like the buffalo, the prairie, or not the prairie dog, the skunk, the screech owl. They all came to basically talk to the Lakota people because they were sitting around and they were being gloomy and sad. And the animals were taking turns saying, "Why are you sitting around? Why are you being sad? Get up, dance, move. We didn't give you people. We didn't give you kinship so that you could be sad. And in each of the animals' admonishments to the people, they say this, something along the lines of, you're going to hear this. You might hear this. You might know this, but you won't really understand until you derive it through the spirit, until you attain that knowledge through the spirit. And so my mom is, she'll probably get mad at me for mispronouncing this word, Ithakji. She was saying how like that kind of reflects when somebody talks, when somebody's talking about some idea, when they talk about it, she says, you know, when they have this kind of deeper connection to what they're talking about, this knowledge that comes from something further back. And so as you think about like terms like, you know, I remember you, Chiksia, well, like in Lakota, like the wau is like very stated, very like literally as I am. That's the statement like as I was. But the philosophical, maybe poetic way of looking at that is saying what I remember becomes a part of my being. So as I was looking through a lot of this stuff, it's talking a lot about embodied knowledge. It's talking about how knowledge needs to come from something deeper. And so the ways I start looking at how we come to know is through looking at our elders and looking at place and embodied knowledge. So Amanda Holmes and Rosalie Little Thunder, who's my late aunt she was St. John, they kind of talk a lot about how elders show us how to attain knowledge through the spirit. And that's by slowing down. That's by being perceptive, being deliberate. They talk a lot about compassion and gentleness. And so I think a lot about like a lot of our stories or a lot of our songs. And a lot of our songs, they tell us like, sit and behold the birds, behold the buffalo. And what they're really saying is see, look, but it's telling us to be attentive. And the way we reach that kind of attentiveness is by slowing down, by being still. And so a lot of that way of coming to know by modeling elders, we can think back to any of us who had the privilege of learning from a grandparent. A lot of that knowledge came from watching our grandparents, watching how they would sew, how they would move in space, how they were very gentle and how they might like plant or farm or make bread. And there was a kind of learning there that was essential to, at least for me growing up. It wasn't just, here are the words, the Lakota words that will help you become Lakota. There was the spirit in the language, the spirit in how we came to knowledge. And so watching elders, that's one way we come to know. But coming to know is also coming to know in place. And so one of the things that you see a lot in our songs is go watch the birds, behold the birds. There's this beautiful song about watching the swallows before a storm. Before, like as the storm and the clouds are kind of building, you'll see the swallows flying all over the place. And it looks like, and there's this kind of wonder about why don't the birds ever run into each other? And what looks chaotic to us is not chaotic to the birds. There's a deep sense of knowing each other's place, knowing where they're going to go. And so if you look at how we do there was this beautiful video of the Black Hills Powwow last year where the fancy shawl dancers are dancing in unison. I think of that as birds. There's this deep attentiveness in space, knowing where others are moving. That's what I think of kinship. That's what I think of collectivity. It requires us to be attentive. It does require a sense of knowing your place in space and community. And so there's this part where we're supposed to go out into these places. We're supposed to go and kind of just sit on a hill or sit in the trees and there's another song where it's like, be so quiet, so still. If you're that quiet and still, you might even hear the flowers whispering. And so there's this beautiful knowledge that tells us all this stuff. And so this is kind of my way of thinking, okay, well, this is how we come to know. This is how we're learning. What does that look like in technology, though, right? There's a very different logic that happens with technology. Oh, before I move on. So going back to place on the tree, as a little child, our people did burial scaffolds. So they would wrap them in sage and buffalo robes, and they would put them up in a tree or on these like poles. And so we didn't actually bury our people. But what had happened was, like, over time, we didn't do monuments. We didn't have like tombstones. You would just kind of disappear over time. Like they would always say, you become grass upon the hills. As a child, what would happen is if you had somebody in like beaded regalia, the ants would take those beads back. And so if you were ever like out on the prairie, like out at my grandparents', we would be looking and playing with, the ant hills. And every once in a while, out in the middle of nowhere, you would find these beads in these ant hills. That idea has been a big part of understanding how I critique technology, how I understand modernity and rationality. For Indigenous people, decay is kind of like, for Lakota, from my coming to know from place, I've been playing with this idea of decay, that a lot of what we innovated also returned back to the earth. Understanding Western technology, it's actually they're trying to push off decay. So you see your buildings, there's constant efforts to manicure lawns, to preserve even the body after it dies. So I started to see decay as this tension. Fast forward, I'm at the American Philosophical Society. I'm reading through Ella Deloria's notes, and the word that we use a lot for like iron, for new technology, is this word maza. As I was looking through it, Ella Deloria translates maza as petrified wood or something resistant to decay. And I was like, wow, this is kind of this nice little thing that's coming together, that there is something there. And one of the biggest phrases in our culture, this they would say a lot at giveaways, was this nakenula wangwe, which I'm kind of saying like that because I'm probably mispronouncing. But the idea was, it's ephemeral is my life. So there's this kind of fluidity, this kind of like, when we look at oral stories, there's something very ephemeral about them. We're not like having these written records that are like strictly preserved. There's actually something very like beautiful about the way our stories move. So if I were to tell a story and then my nieces and nephews tell that story, what is beautiful about oral stories is that's what gives them life. That each of us, in retelling the story, gives a piece of us to that story. And so that is what gives our stories that fluidity, that vitality. And so coming to technology, though, then how do we understand putting stories into archives, into databases, into even a museum archive? There's this word, preservation. You hear that a lot, like we have to preserve the language, we have to preserve the culture. We are a little weary of that word preservation, because is that standardizing? Is that giving that same sense of vitality and life, reading a story? And so there's this concept, be wary, this is Wakan. Like, I'll finish that in a second. So coming from basically all these different kind of Lakota ideas from my upbringing, from language, from stories, I start creating kind of this list of critiques I make of technology. Like, we start thinking back to storage. If we didn't have memorials, my grandpa, when my grandma died, he actually burned a lot of her stuff. And he told her, they would tell us, don't hold on to their spirit, let those things go. And so trying to reconcile this idea of, well, now we're creating these archives, we're creating these like, these storage units that aren't storage units, these like storage databases that, can, I think, house more stories and like photos and stuff than any of us could probably have. It would take us an entire lifetime to look at all of that. That's a very different way of thinking about memory than I think a lot of how we understand, like, memory in Lakota concepts. And then so there's also this idea of digital utopianism. It's the idea that, technology is neutral. Technology has no logics. There is nothing in there. I'm arguing no, technology does have logics. One of the biggest ones is efficiency. Everything in like how we interact with digital technology is about time, maximizing your amount of time. Coming from, again, the elder of slowing down, and you meet these logics of like, you can read any story you want. at your fingertips, and then you can just quickly move on. That's kind of where we're getting at with this project is how are we going to incorporate our logics against what already exists in a lot of these tools. A lot of data sovereignty is about access. It's about having everybody to, in our community to be able to access materials. And so what I'm starting to basically trying to argue with my dissertation work is just saying that, we really need to think a lot, not just about having the stories, having access. How are we going to experience these stories? The fact that we're all separated, the fact that we need a mapping tool, the website, is a reflection of the fact that we are dispersed. This is what colonialism has done, is has separated us from one another. So these are kind of these tools, eventually, hopefully, to get us back into community in place. But how do we put our values into these things? How do we create, websites that refuse this urgency, refuse precarity, refuse this scarcity mindset? And so, Sam had already brought this up, but, we are really thinking about not just like access, but experiencing. How do we want people to come onto this website and learn meaningfully, to learn from the heart, to learn from the mind, to learn from the spirit? And so there's that part of learning from the spirit, but also caring for the spirit in the stories, in the data. If we believe as Lakota people that everything has a spirit, then how are we going to, care for that? How do we slow things down? How do we hypermediate, index, and search? We're trying to question everything. You have a website and you can go and search through an index. Is that a Lakota way of coming to know? You would sometimes go to an elder and you would maybe ask a question, and they may tell you a story that you may feel at the time has nothing to do with what you asked. There was even stories they would leave unfinished. So how do we account for that versus kind of this ability to search and to immediately pop up what you're looking for? What does that do for learning? And so, we're thinking about hyperlinks and design, visuals, all those things. How do we make those reflective of, as best as we can, of a Lakota Dakota epistemology? So this thing about be wary, this is Waka. One of the stories my Aunt Rosalie Little Thunder was sharing was that this concept of Waka, there's a lot of debate about how to translate it. Some people say it's like mystery. Some people say it's something about like, this is sacred and this is, really powerful. She has a story where they're talking about this metal badge. And she says that, her grandfather, she was a security officer for a bit. And when she was walking by, her grandfather said to her, "Be wary." And he pointed at that metal badge and he said, "This is Wakan." And she thought about that for a long time. And what she came to understand later was that Waka could be any object like metal, like technology that has the power to influence people, to influence the collective, to do good or to corrupt. It could corrupt you. So this idea that, I was kind of playing around, but, I was like, well, then maybe social media is Waka. Maybe these websites are Waka. And so knowing that, how do we be critical about all these aspects? How do we don't take for granted that we can go on an index and just search for whatever we want? How can we be critical about that? And I'm going to send it back to Sam.
Yeah, that reminds me, just to give an example of what we're talking about and some of the things we've explored as far as creating the website and really insisting on an Oceti Sakowin way of moving through story is, for instance, and this is beautiful because the technology and the ability to do this through technology is meeting us at this point where we are able to do things. For instance, if a storyteller gives us a story, and it's our storytellers who are going to direct sort of access and direct these kinds of details, but there are certain stories in Dakota and Lakota Oceti Sakowin culture that are only appropriate to tell when there's snow on the ground. Okay, so how do we sort of allow, with the technology, that to be honored about a story, that you can't access it unless there's snow on the ground, and there are ways we can do that now. So that's just an example of some of the things we're thinking about. But some of our primary goals from the start was creating an Oceti Sakowin ethics of seeing in the structure of the site. And so we've looked at a lot of different mapping options. We're still, in fact, exploring design in this way. But again, sort of moving away from, Cartesian modes of mapping and really understanding place from the Oceti Sakowin tradition. So we're looking at those kinds of things, being guided by community and building consensus. So this is one of our biggest points, and I think it's something we keep in focus at every step of the way, is that we're interested in hearing from community what they want to see in a site and what they want to give as stories that might go on the site. So for instance, we aren't dictating the kind of story you might offer, or is this a story from the oral tradition, a long held story, a particularly sacred kind of story, or is this a story connected to place that speaks to, my grandfather's generation, my dad's generation, my generation, our contemporary moment in these places. So we aren't limiting sort of the scope of story connected to place. We want to keep that open to what the community wants to offer, and recognize that there are certainly going to be stories that community deems inappropriate on any website. Keeping that community-led element at the forefront is really important to us. Another thing was the focus on visuals and audio. Is really, we're asking for recordings of these stories, whether they be audio or connected to video, and both. In part because we do want to invite stories in the language, and that many of our stories might be part of the ongoing effort in language revitalization. But again, we aren't limiting stories to Dakota or Lakota language. We welcome the storyteller to make those decisions for themselves. The other thing is, there's a lot of question about how to represent our languages in text. And so for now, we're for the most part expecting to leave off any transliterations of stories, but we envision that as potentially a project for language learners down the road, and those opportunities. The other thing is caretaking the archive, again, attending to things like I mentioned, that we can now do with the technologies at hand, attending to seasonality of certain stories, attending to community access or holding off access. So for instance, if folks at Sissetuan or Sisseton want to share a particular story and put the story in the archive, but want it limited to Sisseton community members, there are ways for us to really toggle those bits of access and make sure we're doing this in the appropriate way. And that would all come from information we get when people share their stories and how they want it to be shared.
And I will just jump in to kind of tie this back to, this idea that, we have, like Sam said earlier, we kind of have funny feelings about calling stories data, but there's kind of this radical idea of returning back to this concept of decay or forgetting, or the right to mystery, to escape, settler state surveillance is, we're asking ourselves, do stories also have the right to rest? Again, going back to the museum or the archive or the database, that, you can keep the stories in perpetuity, or you can keep these documents really carefully and attend to them. But if there's a spirit in those stories, when do they, when we think about the lifespan, how do we care for that? How do we care for, that spirit, if a spirit has a right to rest? And I want to say, decay, I had a friend I was struggling with kind of like, thinking about decay as this process that happens quickly. And she said, well, decay is not obliteration. Decay might happen over 500 years or whatever. So, understanding what is the appropriate lifespan of maybe these objects or these stories, or, and how do we get them maybe from sitting in one individual versus back into the collective, where we start to remember the stories meaningfully, imprinting them in our mind from the heart, and we start telling those stories back to community. That's kind of what I think, is the vision eventually. And so one of the things that we, of real obvious, not obvious, but one of the first examples I think we came up with was, okay, well, what's one way we can create slowness? And we thought about, well, what if in our videos we remove the ability to rewind or fast forward? What if you sit with this video and you watch it and we tell you, you actually have to put everything else aside and be present and watch this? Maybe that's one of our ways that we can indigenize technology, is to indigenize those little features, the hyperlink, and so those are some of the ways that we are trying to think of stuff. And I guess, maybe this can transfer to over the challenges, but, we're just a few people. We're probably limited by our own imagination. That's why we seek out elders and fluent speakers who are kind of helping us think of, all the little features in a website. How can we make this more reflective of our epistemologies, our ethics of seeing, as Sam said? And I'm going to pass it back to Sam to kind of talk a little bit more about some of the challenges we face with MOUs and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, just to start with the first point here on the slide, and thinking again back to data sovereignty, which is, really becomes such a big issue in the project that I think we knew it would be important, but really figuring out, even before we begin to collect story and community, and we've done a little bit of, we have some stories, but we really haven't started the bulk of our story collection, because before that we really had to get into place from the moment that this record is made. Where is it going to live, and how are we really being responsible to the story and to the protections that need to be around that story to really perform what we, many of us in Native studies talk about digital sovereignty quite a bit, but how do you really perform that? So it was a really interesting, fascinating journey to kind of figure out our path, and to still not know if it's enough. Because as we said earlier, really to have data sovereignty, we would need our own network of servers at play here. And we're hoping that's where this project will end up. And that's our intention. Our intention from the outset was that this map and site would not live on university, our affiliated university servers in the end, that it would be in the hands of community. And so that is still something we're working toward in partnership with tribes and community. But to build it, we are building it through our university affiliations. And so my co-PI, Chris Pexa, is at Harvard University, and we're working with the team there at the tech team at Darth to build the site. And in an interesting way, we've had to create these memoranda of understanding with Harvard that really outline the plan for this data and this site, that the data may live within Harvard systems for a certain amount of time, but at the end of the project, the entire site and all of the data connected to it will be moving into tribal hands, and Harvard will have no claim to it. Likewise with the other universities we're affiliated with. We also, talked to the folks at Harvard because it's very hard to collect this amount of data, lots of video stories in one place, without putting them in one of the cloud, in the cloud space. And interestingly, Harvard has made their own agreements with Amazon, for instance, their own legal agreements. Of course, lots of great lawyers at Harvard have worked on their own protections for any data material connected to Harvard that, faculty, out of faculty research that's put into the Amazon cloud. There are legal protections for that material. And so because we have access to Harvard and the Harvard system, we already we're taking advantage of the legal frameworks they've put in place to protect their own data within the Amazon cloud. Now, I say this, and there's something in me, I guess, as a Native person that says we may have these agreements on paper, we may have a memorandum of understanding, but there is always risk. And so when we go to communities and present this or face questions about how we're going to protect these stories all along the way until we can get this firmly back into community hands on our own server, is to acknowledge that despite all of our efforts and protections, there is risk in having our data move from place to place, being in these systems for however long they're in. But it was really important for us to really think about that. Serving community, I think we really did talk about this. One of the beautiful ideas and both a challenge and a hopeful part of our vision is that this site live in community afterwards, and that it actually fuels beyond the original idea of being an archive for storytelling, but rather that communities participate in building this site out in ways that are important to them. So we've talked about lots of different strategies for what the afterlife of our part of the project might look like. But gathering community participation, really understanding what availability there is within tribal communities to house the site in the end. These are all challenges that we are continually working on. And then finally, resources, having to make compromises to work within the systems and technological frameworks that have been built. I mean, this is what we've been talking about the entire time, is really how does one build a site like this, and as much to our ability maintain that Oceti Sakowin way of seeing and produce something that is firmly representative of Oceti Sakowin thought, when everything, so much of what we know and experience in the digital world is guided by a lot of settler colonial frameworks. Now, I don't want to cede all of it to settler colonial logics, because we're here, we've been participating in the digital space as long as there's been a digital space. We're all here. But a lot of those frameworks do tend to be informed by the dominant culture systems that we're in. Kaylen?
And I'll just add, so there is this part too about, again, resisting the idea of the database or the archive or the storage to house everything. And maybe maybe the people will decide it's okay, but we ask ourselves, well, what stories maybe are appropriate for this kind of site? Maybe some story, we firmly believe there are stories, you have to learn in community. There's knowledge you have to learn in place. So what kind of stories fit? And following back the oral tradition, you know, a lot of our stories involve like a character, a hero going through a journey and coming to know. So the way I kind of envision this is that, well, what if we create this where it's like you're going on a journey and you're kind of, you know, hearing these stories. What kind of stories fit for the individual versus maybe a story you need to hear with people around you. So those are kind of those, you know, I guess trying to make these kind of compromises or trying to work within the system, and where there might be limitations, where how can we adapt for that? And I don't know if you have anything else to say, Sam. We can just go into the Q&A otherwise.
Yeah, I think we're
And
ready.
I can stop share, right? Stop share? Okay, got it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have been jotting down tons of questions, but I imagine other people have too. We are a little past 4, so I just want to say that you know, if folks have to leave, we won't be offended. But if the presenters are willing to hang out for a little bit and answer some questions, we're happy to take some time to have that conversation. Any questions? You can raise your hand, you can put a question in the chat. Yeah, I'll just start since nobody has a question yet. This is a little off topic, but I just kept questioning as you were talking about what you must, you know, experience this in a lot of the work you do, but it just seemed like a lot of what you're doing is pretty opposed to academic spaces and it's like to do this within spaces that don't value a lot of this, you know.
Well, let me just jump in first and say that it was really heartening when we set out and wrote the grant proposal that Mellon was particularly looking for projects where the bulk of the money, the grant money, was into communities and not be sort of get stuck in the university space. And so the vast majority of our grant money is earmarked to go directly to our what we call our tribal research fellows, who we're hiring to be those who are in community and gathering story, as well as our advisory council. And that really appealed to Chris and I and our whole team, this idea that you know, this academic grant, you know, Mellon funding, really was emphasizing this idea that the money go to serve and end up in community. So that's what that question makes me think of. But I will say it has been really revealing to work within our own institutions and come up against, you know, just see how different institutions react to being asked to create and sign an MOU, that understanding that these materials that we as academics are producing within our institutions aren't going to be held by the institution. And it is really, it says a lot about which institutions kind of readily agree and which ones we have to talk a little bit more with the lawyers. And so, yeah, it's been revealing, interesting, sometimes fun, sometimes incredibly frustrating.
I saw that Margot Lucan's hand was up, so I'll let her take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This is really an engaging presentation. And I just wanted to go back to something I think I heard Samantha say about decay not being equivalent to obliteration, that in fact there's some kind of maybe a change of the state of matter, right? And I'm thinking about it in terms of a project I've been involved with people in the Penobscot Nation. And you're talking about taking recordings of a storyteller actually telling a story verbally. And in our case, we're talking about, we have a book of texts that were collected from a storyteller at the turn of the 20th century. And but the same kind of questions obtain there. The question about does this one version freeze a story, or does it in fact, what are the steps we need to help occur to, let community people take that story and begin telling it again for their own purposes. I just wondered whether you have any very specific thoughts about steps to take to once you've got that recorded version, whether it's a video, audio, or a book, what are the steps to give it back and help it go into the next state of matter?
Great question. I'm going to throw over to Kaylen, Kaylen, the sort of theoretical framework is coming out of her work. So.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the question where so much of, I think, knowledge, research, even technology, digital technology is all about that point of access, that once you have that in your hands, you'll know it. That's why we're trying to say, well, how are we going to experience this from Lakota, Dakota epistemology? And I think so, even coming to a text, how do you get that back into kind of this space where it lives in you? And I think that's kind of where, as far as the technology goes, like if we present a story and it's a recording, we were messy, and this is going to be controversial, but we're just like doing these thought experiments as, what if you watch that video and you can't return to it? Or maybe you request the video if it's a relative and you can keep it, but how do you, Sievert Youngbear said that the problem with text, the problem with what technology is, he said, it can make you careless. We have storage and we have these bookmarks and we have all these materials. And it's this logic that's kind of like, well, we can go and I can go back and look at it. I don't really need to remember it right now. It's resisting that. He says that we need to somehow get it where the story sticks in you. It goes from the mind to the body. That's the challenge though, because it's not just us providing stories. It's not even just us trying to help shape the experience. It's really back in the community of reclaiming our ways of learning and knowing. And so that, we can only do so much, we can only, but, that's a part of, a bigger project of, language revitalization, our epistemologies. And so I think we can do as much as we can, but really there's that part where, it's just one little part of, I think a bigger project for a lot of Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah.
We also have a question from John Peacock.
Omatakue. I'm John Peacock from the Spirit Lake tribe, and I live in Washington, D.C. About 20 years ago, when my fellow tribal member, Neil McKay, was teaching his Dakota language course from the university, I wanted to take the course, but I wasn't there, so he started teaching it hybrid. I was the first online student he taught. And at about the same time, there were some members of my tribe who lived on the reservation and who were studying the language with the elder there, but they couldn't make her in-person class because they worked. And so we were trying to set it up so that they could take the hybrid course as well. And we went to the elder, who was teaching it in person on the reservation. And she said, absolutely not, that the language could only be be taught from the reservation, on the reservation. And I'm wondering how much of that thinking has changed? Have you run into anything like that? This idea that the language is too sacred to be online or even taught any place other than on the reservation? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think it highlights something really important, and there are serious ongoing discussions in our communities about how we do language teaching, in all of these ways, including, should it be online? I will say there has been a proliferation of availability of language classes online. And part of that came out of COVID, right? I mean, for this meeting, for instance, maybe we were doing these Zoom talks beforehand, but it seems like now this is kind of just part of our world, and same with the language classes. But I wouldn't doubt that there are concerns voiced in various places in community about language learning in these digital spaces, or I think we ask ourselves this question, and have great folks on our advisory council who ask, is this a worthy project? Is it too risky to collect story and put it in a digital archive? Are we archiving in the way a lot of these, some of the museums have archived us in the in the early 1900s or the late 19th century? Are we repeating this pattern, or are we able to use technology and break out of those modes in order to have that heart-mind resonance and experience? And I think for our team, our position is, it's not for us to say, and we will hear from community if there are appropriate stories, and I think there will be, if community finds it appropriate to give us stories and put it into this archive and learn in this way. But we respect when the answer is no. So yeah, Kaylen, I don't know if you want to add thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I will say that, there's this, uh, there's always the risk of people, like my work can be very critical of technology. And so there's risk of, I'm not a Luddite. I always tell people I am not a Luddite. I engage on, social media. I'll FaceTime people. But I think, one of the biggest questions a part of my work looks at fame and status. And, I said earlier, we didn't have tombstones. We didn't have this memory of people in the same way that Western society does, that you have this obituary. And I see that as a beautiful thing, like that I don't think any of us wants all of our data, everything we've done online, to live forever and become this thing that's like, this is who Kaylen was when she was online. Like, I think the right to mystery is an Indigenous right. It's a human right that we should be able to refuse being like surveilled. And going back to this Lakota way of like understanding, though, we do have memorials now. We didn't have, we do have tombstones. We go back, we have these memorial rites. And so my advisor, Jeannie O'Brien, kind of challenged me once and said, well, what do you make of that? And it's understanding that our community is just, we don't live in community the same way we did before. So thinking of these things as anchors, this isn't the endpoint. This website isn't the endpoint, but how can it serve as an anchor to get people back in community, to get people into place? And I think that's the reality we're dealing with, is we still need people to learn. But how can we take that learning, that experience, and pull it as much as we can back towards our values? And so I see this kind of as an anchor, like a kind of just I lost my train of thought, but I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Sam.
I don't think I have anything to add. I was reading questions in the chat as well.
We have a couple of hands up and a few questions. I think we have 5 right now. So I wondered what's your energy level for continuing to answer these questions? Should we keep going? Okay, so I think Jacqueline Fear-Segal's question is in the chat. Oh, and you answered that. Okay. Then the next was Travis Ryder.
Amboa Stitch, Minisni Madant. Hello, I'm from Canada. I'm Dakota. And my question is a little bit of it was mentioned, but in terms of our storytelling, our stories are ours to tell. Some of our stories are not translatable, and there's also the 10, 20 years from now, what if Lakota stories are being appropriated by other nations? We see that happening in today's world. A lot of Indigenous groups are looking for their stories, but oftentimes when they read a story or hear a story from another nation, and also non-Indigenous people are also appropriating our stories. In terms of elders, what are their thoughts on that? I just wanted to ask that question because for us, linguistically, we're still strong, so we still tell our stories in the language, but we've written a few, and but not a lot. But I think we're at that point where we need to pass on those stories, but it's just a way of how do we pass it on?
This is Damayaye for the question. It's, I think, a question that weighs heavily on us, and like as you mentioned, and as we've said, we're guided by what community wants to share in this kind of a platform. And for those on our advisory council, we are often hearing that, this sentiment that it's time to share, it's time to record some of this. In particular, an elder in the community in the Twin Cities area. I think of Jim Rock, who is a keeper of a lot of our star knowledge. A lot of it, he talks about this. He talks about keeping it under wraps for many, many years, but he's at the age where he's feeling more urgency to make sure that that knowledge remains for future generations. And so, again, I don't think it's for those of us creating the project to make those decisions, to be guided by community. But I think in large part what we're hearing from our advisors is that there is a need for this. And the hope is that, this kind of goes back to the other previous questions as well, the hope is that we build a site in a way that is really engaging across generations, but obviously for the younger generation as well, so that that storytelling, and if you do it so that the person participating with the website is going on a journey through these stories in a way that, again, we hope gets into mind and heart, then it isn't about the story living in the digital space. It's about the digital space being a medium through which the story travels from voice to voice to head and to heart, and that these stories really should live on in an embodied way is our hope. So yeah, really great question, and one that we're asking ourselves a lot, and that we definitely need you know, experts and elders from communities across across the border to join the project. So thank you.
I think the next question is Robert Walls. Do you want to do you want me to read that to you, or?
I'm just reading through. So
Okay.
do you envision protocols for respectful non-Indigenous or settler use of the site for those who want to learn, but not be seen as conducting potentially problematic surveillance? Great question. Again, this is part of when we sort of have an agreement with story sharers, and story sharers share sort of specific elements of how they want that story to be seen on the site. The story sharers themselves could limit it to not just, you know, to Native or Oceti Sakowin viewing, but limit it even to communities within. So for instance, like I said, you could limit it to, you know, this story is limited to the Sisseton community. Now, sort of monitoring that is difficult. So again, we have to tell community that how we monitor access is limited, that there's risk, that it won't be perfectly done. However, we anticipate and expect that there are stories that would be more broadly shareable, that our community would be open to sharing more widely. However, I think when anybody goes to the main site, you aren't going to get very far into this without certain permissions and certain levels of access. So our hope and anticipation is that story sharers will have certain stories that are more broadly shared outside of the Oceti Sakowin communities, but that remains to be seen. So a really, really great question that we're anxious to see where that goes as well.
We have one more question, and I think I'll read that and then let you answer it, and then we can wrap up. Yvette Ramirez says, "This is an incredible project, so looking forward to continuing to follow y'all's work. I am specifically interested in the not knowing or pushing back on what Kaylen was saying in regards to the values embedded in the search function of obtaining information immediately. This is something I have come across working with diaspora Quechua and Aymara communities or relatives in regards to knowledge around dance. Are there other authors or elders, specifically Indigenous, who have written and spoken on this?"
So I'm going to reread the question. So as far as not knowing, that concept came from kind of me wrestling with one of the definitions of our term waka is mystery. And so to me, this idea of mystery of kind of, so where my grandparents are buried, the cemetery is kind of, I guess you could say is in decay. You know, there's a lot of tombstones that have been lost, the grave markers are missing, and you might think of it as being neglected. And I was trying to read something more positive on that, is that, well, maybe we're returning back to collective story. And when you look at the role of mystery and not knowing in our culture, there's something foundational to understanding, like our sense of humanity. So you find that mystery, this not knowing, these unfinished stories really inform kind of, you know, it inspires imagination, it inspires connection, but it really grounds us to place and grounds us to community. And so there's all these little stories you would hear where it would just be like maybe 2 sentences. And I felt comfortable sharing this story. They used to say, well, there's, you know, these tiny little horses that live under the river where my grandparents are at. And that's all you would ever hear. And all my life, I'm like, I want to know more. And maybe that's all we know, right? And so wrestling with kind of that not knowing, that's kind of just kind of really thinking about some of the foundational ideas in our culture and reconciling that, right, with like search and kind of this, this idea, if I want to know something, I can just look it up and find this specific topic on this, on this question. It goes back to, well, if you go to an elder, they may not tell you what you're looking for. But even like, when I came to American Philosophical Society and was reading through all of Ella Deloria's, materials, I didn't go in and say, here are the topics I want to look for. I just sat down and went page by page by page. And whatever I learned was whatever I learned, right? And so the search function, we would probably get a lot of resistance to say, we're going to get rid of it. And you learn what you learned. But I think what I'm telling people is, there'll probably be an index, there'll probably be a search, but let's be critical of those things. Understand that this is a way, there's an assumption about a way of knowing by having the ability to look for whatever we're searching for versus going out and sitting in nature. I was saying how a part of reclaiming our knowledge is also reclaiming the animals that taught us their ability to move in nature. The buffalo, so much of our knowledge came from observing the buffalo. If the buffalo are restricted in movement and restricted, how does that affect us as Lakota in our knowledge making? So there's these different ways where the radical idea of Lakota, this acquiring wisdom, is wait, be patient. And that's so at odds with the search. So it's not, I don't think we're going to get rid of a search function, but, we are going to be mindful of it, understand that this might be another way of knowing or thinking. And I think just to, and we were even talking about naming meta tags, like, we have to add meta tags. And that's been a huge debate for us, because once we start adding these tags to videos, to material, we are creating a narrative, right? And I think people take that for granted. So it's just, again, getting in, I don't have a specific author or elder, but just look into your stories. That stuff's all there. Look into the language. All of that is there.
Yeah, just to add to that, just looking at, the latest in data sovereignty research, but also I think a big connection to this idea of it's really pushing back on such a settler colonial structural practice of an attitude of I have the right to access and know everything. And that, if you're looking for some academic works that address that, I would look at some of the great Indigenous museum studies titles. And I just want to say thank you all so much. What a lovely way to spend the afternoon, and thanks for these wonderful questions that we will continue to think about. And thanks to Kaylen, who really championed this.
Thank you both so much for this really wonderful, thought-provoking talk. And I'm sure that you've been reading the, non-questions, but just, congratulations and praise in the chat. And we've had a number of questions about whether this will be available later. So when we put the recording up, we'll let you all know. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks for hanging out to the slightly delayed end. Bye.